today I'm going to try to cover two general topics. One is the existence of God, and one is the reliability of the Bible. I'm going to have to go super fast, and I'm leaving tons out. Feel free to interrupt me with questions as you have them, but we're going to do the best that we can. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about is, if you're thinking about the question of whether or not God exists, you have to, one of the things that you're going to come up against is the epistemological problem of atheism. Now, epistemology may be a new word for you. It is simply the study of how we come to know things. It's a branch of philosophy. Pistis is the Greek word for faith, which is an interesting root for a word that's really about knowledge. Anyway, so epistemology is how do you know? It's the how do you know questions. So in philosophy, metaphysics is the area where we talk about what things are real. Epistemology is how we talk about how we come to know things. And the argument that I'm going to make is that if you're an atheist, you can choose to be an atheist, but you have to be an atheist by faith, because you can't prove atheism. And it's not a problem that's unique to atheism, but it's the problem of making absolute statements about things not existing. Because if you say that something absolutely does not exist, what you're doing is it's a surreptitious claim to infinite knowledge. Okay? Because in order to know that something or a kind of thing doesn't exist, you'd have to know everything. Here's an example. I got this from Robbie Zacharias. He said, if I said that there are no white stones with black dots on them in the universe, well, I would have had, in order to justify that as knowledge, I would have to have gone everywhere in the universe and picked up every stone and looked at it in order to justify that. Okay? But I don't have that kind of knowledge, so I can't make that kind of absolute claim. Right? So one way of thinking about it, if this is the possible content of all knowledge in the universe, what percentage of that do you think that you yourself have? 10. 10? Okay. I would be more modest, but Maris, we'll go with your 10%. Okay. And then the question is it possible that in this 90% of things you don't know, there's information or experiences that would lead you to believe that God exists? And I think most people with appropriate humility have to say, well, yeah, there is. Okay. And so I want to show you the difference between an atheist position and an agnostic position. So atheism comes from, again, Greek, theos. Is the negative. So atheism is if you look it up in the dictionary of philosophy, it says it is the affirmation that the sentence, God exists, is a false proposition. Okay? So it's kind of a hard thing. And now a lot of atheists have backed off of this because it gets them clobbered because of this epistemological problem. Okay? There is another position, the agnostic position, and it comes from the Greek gnosko. Gnosko is the Greek word to know. And so an agnostic is someone who doesn't know, right? Or they haven't come to a conclusion. Okay? Let me back up and just drive home the point I was making before. Okay, so Maris is 10% of knowledge. Maybe she's an atheist right now because in her 10% she hasn't had knowledge or experience of God, but she's willing to acknowledge that in this 90%, maybe there's some that she wouldn't have. And maybe there's information about God in there. All right. But if she were to say, no, I know that I know that I know that I know that God does not exist, okay? It's a surreptitious claim to infinite knowledge, right? It is that she would say, not only in this 10%, but also in the 90% that I don't know, I can say assertively that God does not exist. Well, and the problem is that if you're making a claim to have complete knowledge, well, what do we call a person who has complete knowledge of the universe? God. We call him God, right? Okay. So God is the only person who could be in a position to make the statement that God does not exist. Or to put it another way, an atheist has to, in terms of what they know, has to claim to be the person they say that does not exist, right? And so there's this epistemological problem. But agnosticism is a tenable position philosophically. Now, there are three types of agnostics. Did I put them on your outline? Read them to me. You have the seeking agnostic, you have the apathetic agnostic, and the philosophical agnostic. Let me just explain these three. And then I gotta move. Okay, the seeking agnostic is like, I don't know if God exists, but I'm interested. I'd like to know. Like, in other words, they would like to explore some of this 90% that they don't know. The apathetic agnostic says, I don't know if God exists and I don't really care. It doesn't affect my life. I actually think that's a very dangerous position to hold. Because if God exists and we understand all the implications from that, man, you just can't do that. Well, I guess you can if you want. The philosophical agnostic says that it is not in principle possible to know whether God exists. Okay? And this taps into something that's actually really true. Because if God is transcendent in the way that Christianity and other religions say that he is, it is entirely possible that us and our human faculties, we simply don't have the capacity to know a being as great or as transcendent or whatever. The illustration sometimes is, you're a blindfolded prisoner chained to the wall of the dungeon, and even if the jailer is standing in front of you, there's no way for you to reach out and touch him or experience him or that kind of thing. But what Christianity says is that the jailer has reached out and touched you, right? How is it that we get knowledge of God? Okay, this is basic Christian theology. The way we get knowledge of God is through revelation. God has to reveal himself, right? This is intuitive in relationships too, right? If you're escorted to a waiting room and there's one other person in there, and then they don't look at you and they don't speak to you, and if you say hello, they don't say hello back. Well, if they won't reveal themselves, if they won't open themselves up, there's not much that you can know. You can know some things, but not all that much. What's the same thing with God, right? If God is this transcendent being, how on earth are we going to be able to know him? Well, the answer is God reveals himself. And God reveals himself, they call it general and special revelation. General revelation is what can be known about God through the universe. Paul talks about this some in Romans 1. And the special revelation is what we know about God through special times that he reveals himself. Prophets, miracles. Christians would say fully and finally in Jesus. And then we'd also say God reveals himself through his word. We look to the Bible because it contains our information about Jesus and prophets and miracles. And so that's how we come to know. So I wanted to begin with the epistemological problem of atheism, even though, hey, Millie, come in, glad you're here. I think there's a chair here, there's a couple over here. You guys can figure it out. All right. So let's move to the cosmological argument. We're going to do the cosmological argument, and I'm going to do the argument from Christ. And man, I'm leaving out so much. If only you knew how much I'm leaving out. Okay? All right. So here's the cosmological argument. Cosmological argument is about the cosmos. How did the universe get here? And is the cosmos' presence a sign or evidence of the existence of God? We think that it is. All right. So the argument goes, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Pretty straightforward. We talked some last week about the universe beginning to exist. Astrophysics, Big Bang cosmology, right? In the Big Bang you have matter and energy and time and space. And before that moment, there was nothing. There was nothing. Okay. So if that is the case, if we are going to speculate about the cause of the Big Bang, the cause of the universe, let's just think about it for a moment. What things could we say about the thing that caused the universe without deciding in advance that it's God or that it's the God of the Bible or anything like that? What could we say about the thing that caused the universe? What do you think? Ed, take a shot at it.
It has intelligence.
Okay, all right. Let's add that to our list. Why would you say that?
The order of things you can see on the earth.
Okay. You know, the universe is not like a bowl of porridge or like a lump of clay. I mean, it has some fairly complex stuff in it. Okay. So I think a lot of people would agree with you. What else? That's one of my. Do I have 7?
It was powerful.
Okay. Yeah, because obviously, to make something so vast and so complicated, like you know, now we wouldn't necessarily have to say that it was like all powerful in the way that like Christians think about God, but certainly the cause had to have some great power in order to make that thing happen. Okay. What else could we say?
Say like it's a design, it has a purposely design, the breathing has to be meant to be.
Okay. So there's a question of intent or of will, and so here's what I'm going to do with this. I'm going to say that points to a personal cause. Okay. And I want to differentiate that from impersonal causes. Like for instance, like natural forces like gravity or wind or the action of waves, right, tend to have predictable and pattern-like effects. Like for instance, the Big Bang banged once and has not banged again since, right? And so, whereas gravity as a force, right, if the thing that caused the universe was like gravity, you would expect something to be continuing to happen. But it seems like the beginning of the universe was this singular thing that just is working out. And so that inclines a lot of people to think that the cause is personal. In other words, that there was a decision, there was intent, there was will behind it. Okay? Probably debatable like most of these things, but it makes sense to me. Let me suggest a couple. Remember that in the Big Bang, astrophysics tells us that time was not a thing before the Big Bang, right? So that time itself was part of what was created, part of what came out of the Big Bang. Let me not prejudice my language, even though I think that's what happened. Therefore, the cause could not be something that was confined to time, right? And so you're going to have the cause is going to have to be timeless. Or I'm gonna borrow this slightly theistic language, or eternal. Okay? But outside of time, for sure. Okay? Remember that space and matter and energy also were created in the Big Bang, so the cause of it had to be what? Has to be non-material. There's a really hilarious clip of what's his name? William Lane Craig debating a guy about this very argument, and the guy says, "I think it's computer," and Craig is like, "Well, a computer is like a physical thing, so that wouldn't really work." He's like, "Oh, not this computer. It's a special computer," and they keep going at it, and then Craig eventually says, "Well, what you're calling a computer is really God, a timeless, spaceless, powerful." You know. Anyway, you can look it up on YouTube as well. It's pretty fun. And so, how many blanks did I put there? I put 6. Okay, and the other one I'm gonna put is self-existent. Okay? In other words, not relying on anything else for its existence, right? Philosophers who have thought about this for many years would call the cause of the universe, like the unmoved mover or the causeless cause, right? Is that if you trace back the sequence of causes, eventually you have to stop somewhere, because the idea of an infinite regress of causes, you know, if you investigate it, is ultimately untenable. Okay, so you have again, and we haven't pulled in the Bible. We're just pulling in what we know about the Big Bang already. We have a personal, intelligent, powerful, timeless, non-material, self-existent being. Which sounds suspiciously like the God of Christianity, or you could say the God of Islam or Judaism, right? A theistic God. So I think this points us toward theism. There are a couple of alternatives that would be suggested for the cause of the universe. One is that the universe came out of a quantum fluctuation. Edward Tryon is a physics professor, and here's his quote. He says, "In answer to the question of why it happened, I offer the modest proposal that our universe is simply one of those things which happen from time to time." Doesn't sound very convincing to me either, okay? So this is one alternate. Another alternate is the steady state theory, which is what was widely held before Big Bang cosmology, right? So hardly anybody believes that the universe has just always been there. Okay? And then the third is the idea of an oscillating universe. And the idea is that the universe banged and it's expanding, but then at some point in the future it'll reverse and then it'll collapse down and then it'll bang again. And then what's posited is that could potentially go on infinitely. And the only problem with that is the second law of thermodynamics, which says that the energy in the universe is slowly winding down. And so even if we are in some sort of oscillating model, eventually it's going to wind down and grow cold. And so even if this were the case, you would still have to come up with some sort of cause to explain why the whole thing was wound up to be. Okay? All right. That's the cosmological argument. We're doing okay. Questions, comments? All right. When you think about the existence of God, there are other big arguments that I think are really compelling that I'm skipping. Some people like the ontological argument, which is the argument for being. It's very abstract, kind of hard to wrap your head around, which is why we're not talking about it today. The teleological argument is the argument from design, and then looks at specific things in creation and wonders how they got to be that complex and theorizes about it. I think that's a really good argument, but we're not going to talk about it because I don't have time. And the other one that I find is really compelling is the moral argument, is that remember secularism from the first week, right? If we live in a materialistic universe, where did these shoulds and oughts, these morals that we all seem to have and all seem to live by, where did they come from? And I think the moral argument says that the best argument for their origin is that we were created in the image of God, who is a moral being. And part of our reflecting his image is that we assume and bring into our interactions all that morality. But we're not going to talk about any of those because I don't have time. Okay? So, this next one isn't really an argument for the existence of God, but I think it's an important argument. It's an argument for, it's really an argument for Christianity. And so it's a dilemma. Jesus Christ was either, you get one of two choices. He was the Son of God, or he was a bad man. I decided to spend some time here because I think the best reason to be a Christian is Jesus, right? If you're convinced of him, of who he is, and you feel drawn to him and his example and to his message and to the idea that he could be what he claims to be, which is the Son of God. If you're convinced of that, I think every other question that you have will fall into place, which is why I want us to spend a little bit of time. Okay? Jesus Christ was either the Son of God or he was a bad man. I put this argument was made in a lot of different places, but very famously by C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity. I got Regents Quote that I put in your notes. I'm trying here to prevent anyone from saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. a man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level of the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, or you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord of God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He's not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Now, some people say that Jesus never claimed to be God, but I think any honest reading of the Gospels is going to disabuse you of that idea. For instance, Jesus forgave sins, right? He took upon himself the authority to forgive sins, and his Jewish critics who were observing him do that always were flummoxed by that. They're like, who does he think he is to forgive sins? Like, because only God can forgive sins. He accepted worship from other people. And he made some really interesting statements, like in John chapter 8, he's having this dialogue with these Jewish leaders, and he says to them, before Abraham was born, I am. And when he says I am, he's using the same words that God used when he gave his name to Moses. I am that I am. Like Moses says, what is your name? And that's what he says. Okay? And so when Jesus says this, all the Jews pick up rocks to stone him to death for blasphemy. In other words, they knew what he was claiming. Okay? And he managed to wiggle his way out of it. 2 chapters later, he does the same thing. He says to them, I and the Father are one. So they pick up rocks because they know what he's saying. And he's like, which of my good works are you stoning me for? And they say, we're not stoning you for your good works. We're stoning you because you, a mere man, claim to be God. So Jesus' observers, right, his interlocutors in the Gospels, knew what he was claiming. Okay? So yes, Jesus did claim to be God. All right, so if he claims to be God, we have a limited number of possibilities. How many L's did I put on there? 3. Okay. One is that he was a liar. Is that he knew he was not God, but he claimed to be God anyway, for whatever nefarious purposes. It certainly wasn't for material gain. It certainly wasn't for a long, comfortable life. You know, they wound up killing him. So if he was after something nefarious, it didn't work out for him. Okay, but this is a possibility. Jesus could have been like a con man who did it deliberately. Okay, he could be a lunatic. Right? In other words, he could be, like today if someone comes along and says, I'm Jesus, usually we try to Baker Act them and have them committed and get them the mental care that they need. Okay. Right? But then the problem with this idea, okay, well, the problem with the liar idea is most people don't buy it when they see everything else that Jesus did and what his life was about. It doesn't seem to sync up with his compassion, with his healing, with his miracles, with just the person that you see him to be in the Bible. Okay? The lunatic thing doesn't really hold up either, because you don't see Jesus behaving erratically. Like, even when he's about to be crucified, he's as cool as a cucumber, man. Very deliberate, very sane, very together, is what you see. Okay? The other possibility is that Jesus was a legend. In other words, he never existed, they just made it up. Okay? When we get to the reliability of the Bible here in a minute or two, okay, so far so good, you're going to see some reasons that this could not be the case. For instance, there are 10 sources that make 43 references in ancient documents to Jesus and to his existence and to his influence that did not come from the Bible. So we have 10 extra biblical sources, and I have them listed in your notes. We'll talk about it. Okay. And so the argument from Christ is that since it's not sensible that Jesus was a liar or a lunatic or a legend, what you're left with is perhaps then he was what he claimed to be, the Son of God. Okay. Any thoughts or questions or interaction about this? You guys are just drinking it in. All right. lot to
Yeah.
It is a lot to take in. Because here's the thing, people respect Jesus. Like, even if you're not a Christian, people respect Jesus. You talk to your standard atheist, they'll be like, yeah, Jesus, he was cool. And there's a lot but their problem is with Christians or with the church or whatever. And so I get it, yeah, Jesus, he's great. When I was studying at UIC, University of Illinois Chicago, I was in some philosophy classes there. There were atheists and Hindus and all kinds of different people. And I took a class on, it was a special topic class on mysticism, which occurs in every religion. And we read some Hindu and New Age type thinkers. And here's the thing about Jesus, everybody adopts him, right? So like Muslims, Jesus is a prophet, but then they're like, oh, by the way, he wasn't crucified because God wouldn't do that, and he's not the Son of God because God wouldn't do that. But they like change those things, but they want Jesus as part of their thing, right? In other words, they won't say, oh no, Jesus, he was just a whack or whatever. No. They adopt him, okay? Hindus do the same thing. He was an avatar of Vishnu, right? Or he was a good example of the Buddha spirit, or like every other religion has to do something with him, right? Because he's such a powerful force. Okay, you can't really ignore Jesus because of the strength of his claim and because of the power of his claim. So that's why I like the argument for Christ. Okay, because I've looked at this and I think Jesus is the Son of God. And remember the first day when we talked about the psychology of the belief is that part of the thing that motivates you to believe is whether you want to believe it or not. Okay? And I think there are a lot of people who intellectually would come to Jesus being the Son of God, but they resist it because they have reasons to want it not to be true. As a matter of fact, what's that guy's name at New York University? Thomas Nagel. He's an atheist philosopher, and he said I think it was in a journal article, is that he wants God not to exist. He does not want the universe to be that way. It was very, very candid to say so. But he's really, really brilliant. All right. Okay, I still have to do the Bible. We're doing okay. I got about half an hour. Anybody have any questions or interaction on anything we've said so far? Remember, I'm just giving you the bare outlines of all of this. And so there may be some level of detail. Okay, let's do a little Bible. Okay? So the Bible is this book. And I'm always interested to hear what people say, when you talk to them about the Bible. You talk to the college frat boy about the Bible, and he's like, I bet they all just got drunk and made it up. I was like, no, you just got drunk and made stuff up last weekend. That's where the Bible came from. Anyway, so as Christians, we believe the Bible is the Word of God. Now, not everybody believes that. Okay? Lots of alternate ideas. A lot of people think the Bible is corrupted, has been subject to corruption for across the centuries, and can't be trusted for those reasons. Okay, so today what I want to do is I want to convince you that the Bible is historically reliable. I'm not going to try to make an argument today that the Bible is the Word of God, but here's how that argument would go. If the Bible is historically reliable to tell us information about Jesus, and especially his resurrection, the historical reliability is enough to get you to make a decision about this. And then if you believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and you're willing to admit that he's the Son of God, well then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to adopt Jesus' view of the Scriptures. And Jesus viewed the Scriptures as the Word of God. Okay? Right? Okay. So just so you know how the argument would flow, I'm just going to get you here, but the rest of the way follows this pattern. And then, if you want to dig into it and trace it all the way out, we can do that later. Okay. So 3 lines of evidence. One is transmission. Do we have the Bible as it was first written down? And then we're going to look at external and internal evidence. Okay. So here's the thing: the Bible is not one book. It is 66 different documents that were written across 1,500 years by about 40 different authors, and were collected into this library, really, that we call the Bible. And we do not have any of the original manuscripts that were written down. Like, for instance, in the New Testament, Paul, he's in prison, he writes a letter to the Colossians, and he sends it over there. So there's one copy. Well, then in Colossae, what they would do is they would get the letter, and then they'd write out a copy of it, or multiple copies, and send it on to other churches that they were aware of. Okay? That was normal practice in the New Testament period. Okay? And so that's why you have all of these copies that still exist, scattered throughout the ancient world. And that's how it got so widely disseminated. But the originals, we don't know what happened to them. Okay? So what we do is we get all these copies, and then we look at all of them, but they don't all say exactly the same thing. There are little variants that come in, because as you probably know, anytime that you write something down, it's like, well, you're not a perfect copyist, right? You're writing on a phone number and you switch two of the numbers, or you leave out a comma. Like, it's that one of those grammar jokes, commas save lives. Let's eat, Grandma. Let's eat. Or let's eat, Grandma. Right? Commas make a difference sometimes, right? And so like even minor things like this is that in some manuscripts there will be a comma afterward, in other places there won't be. And so you have lots of those. Now the critics will tell you that there are hundreds of thousands of discrepancies among the manuscripts. Well, here's how they count them. If you have 100 manuscripts, and one of them has a comma and none of the rest do, then they'll count that as 99 discrepancies. Okay? And most of the discrepancies between manuscripts are superficial and not substantive. Like, for instance, sometimes they'll swap a synonym. Like they'll use a different word. Like instead of "I was hungry," they'll say "I was Spanish." And so lots of the variation is like that. Now keep in mind, the people who were copying it generally had a high regard for what they were writing, right? Even if you were to argue that the early church didn't view the letters of Paul to be the Word of God, they still thought it was something really important that they ought to get right. Okay? And so you have that. So how do we figure out what the original actually said? Well, there is a science known as textual criticism. And it's a set of rules that you follow to compare all of these manuscripts. All right. So first of all, I put a little chart in your note. We're going to compare the New Testament to Homer's Iliad, just to give you a sense of how well attested the New Testament is, okay, among ancient documents. Okay. So this is the number of manuscripts. In the New Testament, we have 5,300. Actually, it's 52 something. So let's round down instead of up. 5,200 either complete manuscripts or partial manuscripts of the New Testament in its original language, Greek, that we've dug up, scattered around the ancient world. 2 of them are almost complete. One was found at the monastery at Mount Sinai, and so it's called Sinaiticus. And another one is stored at the Vatican in Rome. It's called Vaticanus. And generally, if those 2 agree on any reading in the New Testament, that's probably the correct one. Both of those date from about the 3rd century. Okay. If you expand to the Church Fathers and to other languages, other ancient languages that the New Testament was translated to in the early centuries, that number goes up to about 23,000, either complete or partial manuscripts. Okay. Now, if you look at all the ancient documents that we have, the ancient Greek writings and Roman histories and all that kind of thing, the next closest in terms of number of manuscripts is Homer's Iliad, which has 643. Now, the next thing is the time difference between when it was originally written and how old the copy is. In other words, how close are the copies, right? If you have a copy that's 1,300 years distant from the original, okay, well that's quite a space. Okay. Well, our earliest fragment of the Gospel of John is about 125 AD. Okay. And most people think that that's about a 60-year gap. Now, not all of these, many of these are later than that, but some of the ones that we have are this close.
60 years from the original writing.
60 years from the original writing, yeah. Okay. And you have to get into the weeds on that because different books of the New Testament were written at different times. Most of it was written between about 49 and 65 or so, we think. So some as early as 60 years. Okay. When it comes to the Iliad was written in 900 BC, but our earliest manuscript is from 400 BC, and so you have a 500-year gap there. Okay. So, and most other, there's like a half a dozen other ancient texts that are comparable. Some have fewer, well, all of them have fewer manuscripts than this. Some of them are closer or farther away. But this is more the norm for all those ancient documents. And so the New Testament, both in the number of manuscripts and in how close they are to the original writing, like even I told you about Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, were written in like the 300s, right? And so you're talking about, let's call it a 300-year gap, is still better than this for those complete New Testaments. And so in terms of ancient documents, that is extraordinary attestation for the manuscript. Okay. Now, let me tell you about the science of textual criticism and how this works. We actually learned about this when I was taking Greek in seminary. It's a little more complicated than this, but in general, there are 4 guidelines. You do older manuscripts rather than younger, right? Which makes sense because if you have a manuscript of John from the 2nd century, and a manuscript of John from the 7th century, just by virtue of its being closer, it's more likely to be accurate. Okay? So you do older rather than younger. In the geography of the ancient Near East, one of the things we discovered, all right, so Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, Egypt, Turkey, Greece, Italy. Okay? You have 3 basic regions. You have Alexandrian manuscripts that come out of North Africa. You have Byzantine manuscripts that come out of sort of Turkey, Syria, and this area. And then you have Western manuscripts that come from over in Rome. Well, what they discovered is the Alexandrian copyists were much more careful than the other ones. So if all other things are equal, they'll probably prefer the reading down here just because their copies were better. And the Western copies were the worst. There are more errors in Western manuscripts. And the way they found this out is they sat down and they compared them. Okay? And then Byzantine manuscripts are kind of different. Okay? So Alexandrian, then Byzantine, then Western. Okay? Now, scribes would be more likely to add words than they would be to take them away. And so that means that shorter readings are better than longer ones. And scribes were also more likely to smooth out difficult passages and make sense of them than they would to leave in something that didn't make sense to them. And so we prefer harder rather than smooth readings. Okay? In other words, if you read something that doesn't make sense, and then there's a variant that makes more sense, then textual criticism says, no, you need to go with the hard one, because if there's a change, the scribes were more likely to make it easier to read than it would to make them shorter. Now, when you go through all of that and you look at the New Testament, there's about 3 areas in the New Testament that we have today that we think were not original. Okay? One is the pericope of the adulteress in John chapter 8. F.F. Bruce, who's the leading, well, he was the leading textual criticism scholar in the United States. He thinks that particularly the adulteress in John chapter 8 is an original piece of oral tradition about Jesus that was not originally part of the Gospel of John. Because in different manuscripts of John, the story appears in different places. And then there are some manuscripts of Luke that have it put in there as well. So it's like it's a story in search of a home. Okay? And we discovered that by looking at all the things. There's an interpolation in the book of 1 John where a scribe inserted this Trinitarian formula in the middle of a passage. It's in 1 John chapter 5. It's like around verses 7, 8, and 9. And if you have a modern translation, it'll probably be footnoted and it'll have the variant at the bottom. Okay. And then the third major one is the conclusion of the Gospel of Mark. Mark ends awkwardly, the oldest versions of Mark end awkwardly at verse 8, which says, the women who had seen the risen Jesus fled from the tomb and said nothing to anyone. Well, that's a very unsatisfying ending. So what happens is, much later, other scribes come along and they try to finish Mark. And there are 4 different endings of Mark that exist in the manuscripts, but most of them are 13th century or later. All the earliest witnesses have the short ending of Mark. So what does that tell us? That tells us that Mark ended at verse 8 and then people added that after. See? And so what happens is, when people try to add things to the Bible or change it along the way, because of textual criticism, we catch them. Okay? I'll show you another thing. I brought my Greek New Testament and my textual commentary. How am I doing on time? We're going to make it. We're going to make it. So in the Greek New Testament, all right, this is a modern critical version of a Greek New Testament. And Maris, I'll just show you because you're here in the front. Okay? So this is the book of Ephesians. And there's a footnote at chapter 19. And at 19, there's a letter B in brackets there. And so that is the level of confidence that they have that the variant that they put in the text up here is the one that ought to be there. So A, they're super confident. B, they're kind of confident. C, I don't know. D, so they rank them A, B, C, and D. Okay? And so to euangelion means of the gospel, and so that's the reading that's up here. I can't remember what the original English, but it ends with of the gospel, and then there's the footnote. And then what it does is it lists all of the manuscripts that contain that reading, and there's a lot of them. See that little thing that looks like an X? That is the Hebrew character Aleph, which is the symbol for Codex Sinaiticus, which is one of those complete New Testaments that I told you about from the 3rd century. But Vaticanus is the capital B. You see that? So the letter B, see this? Omit. In other words, so that in Vaticanus's version of that, of the gospel does not appear in that manuscript. And it tells you all of the manuscripts that leave it out. So all of these. And then what you can do is you can go into the textual commentary and look up that part in Ephesians.
Do all Bibles have this?
No,
I've noticed little footnotes at the bottom of my Bible, but I never paid attention. I didn't know what it was.
Yeah. English translations will only footnote the really complicated ones, but when you're studying it in Greek, like all the modern critical versions will tell you all the deep details. So if I go to Ephesians, what chapter was that? I don't remember. What it'll do is, that is chapter 6, verse 19. So if I find in translations, Ephesians 6:19, to Angelion, here they give it an A. In other words, they really think that ought to be, and then they give you the reasons why. They give you, because there's a committee of scholars who looked at all of this and they made all the decisions about which ones they were going to put in that edition. And they thought, so if you're really interested in getting into the weeds, it's all there for you. All right. Questions about that? I still have to do external evidence and internal evidence. And again, remember, we're just getting, this just tells us that the Bible we have is 99% what was originally written down. that we can say with great confidence. There's about 400 words or so of the New Testament that are in serious dispute. If you take all those 400 words out and you construct a theology based on what's left, you come out with exactly the same thing. Okay. All right, let's talk about external evidence. Okay. So this is items outside the Bible that help us understand its reliability. Here's one example: historical geography. You might remember the passage in the Gospels where Jesus goes over and he casts the demons, the legion of demons out of the men, and the demons go into the pigs. It says that the pigs rush down a steep bank that goes right into the water. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what happens when you go over to the Sea of Galilee and you go over to the eastern side to where it was? You find, sure enough, there is a steep bank that goes right down into the water. Okay? So if you went over to that region and it was like flat, you would say, wait a second, was there like a calamitous seismic event over here that changed that? No, and you go. So all the details of geography that we get coincide basically with what we know about Palestine and the Near East. If you get into this in the Old Testament, you can go through the list of names of like rulers, who were the emperors in Persia and in Babylon and Assyria, what were their names and all that kind of thing. And before they made some archaeological discoveries, they thought, they just made that up. And then, they dig up a stele and there's the name, the ruler of Assyria. Like, oh my gosh, the Bible was right. And I mean, that's happened many, many, many times. The Book of Mormon, by the way, does not pass the historical geography test because there are some narratives there about some people who went wandering and crossed rivers, and then you go there and I was like, hang on, there's no river there. And there are things like that. And so that's one of the criticisms that's leveled against the Book of Mormon. Okay. Archaeological evidence, there's a bunch. What I did is, at the bottom of your notes, I have the web page where I'm putting like the videos and the handouts and everything. I linked to a YouTube video that talks about like the top 10 archaeological finds that cohere with the Bible. I don't really have time to go into them, but like one of them is Hezekiah's tunnel that says in the Old Testament that there's a tunnel and it led up to the pool of Siloam, and like there's this thing, and for many years scholars thought, nah, they just made that up, there's no such thing. And then they dug it up, they found it. They found it, and there it is, just like the Bible said.
You said you put that in the note down here, the video?
Yeah, if you go to the website, I link to the video from that web page.
Oh, okay.
markwarnock.com/unbelief.
Okay.
Okay. And so you can go and watch that. Okay. Here's the other thing. You have Jesus mentioned by 10 ancient non-Christian sources, which tells us that Jesus was not a legend. Right? In other words, we did not make it up. As a matter of fact, I even heard Bart Ehrman, who is a skeptical scholar at UNC Chapel Hill, he was talking to atheists, and he was saying, to some of you atheists, you're trying to say Jesus never exists. He's like, that's not a good move for you. Like, the evidence is not going to back you up on that. As a matter of fact, let's see, did I mark this? Yeah, I got these references. Here's what we learn about Jesus from non-biblical sources. He lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. He lived a virtuous life. He was a wonder worker. He had a brother named James. He was acclaimed as the Messiah. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He was crucified on the eve of the Jewish Passover. There was darkness and an earthquake when he died, from non-Christian sources, which confirms what the Gospel of Matthew says. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. His disciples were willing to die for their belief. Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome, and his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as a god. That's what we learn from non-Christian sources.
What book is that?
This is Frank Turek, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. This is actually a really, really comprehensive case for Christianity. It goes into a lot of detail, but it's still pretty readable. Frank Turek was the student of Norm Geisler, who is a scholar and apologist. And Frank Turek is kind of a popularizer of his work. There are a lot of YouTube videos of Frank giving talks on all kinds of different subjects. So if you look him up, you're not interested in buying the book, but you still want to see the kind of arguments that Frank makes. Frank's a really kind of an earnest guy, and but his book's really thorough. So good stuff. All right, so that's external evidence. Any questions about that? You guys are just drinking it in. All right, I got about 5 minutes to do internal evidence, and then I'll see what we have. Okay, so I have 5 E's there for you. Okay, this is internal evidence about the Bible, so either items about the Bible or inside the Bible that help us understand its historical reliability. Let me erase this, and we'll do our E's. Someday, someone's going to invent a dry erase board that actually erases. I feel like I'm smearing more than erasing. Okay, the first E is early. You have early testimony. Okay, most of the New Testament was written prior to 70 AD. Okay, like the originals were written prior to 70 AD. If the first Gospels were written like in the 2nd century, you'd be like, how did they know that? Right? Like for instance, we all believe that Abraham Lincoln existed, okay? But none of us have ever seen him. Why do we believe in Abraham Lincoln?
History.
We have history books. Okay. Where are those historical sources from?
The time he was alive.
The time that he was alive. That's right. If our only source of information about Abraham Lincoln, who he was president, what, 1860s? Did I have that right? Civil War era, more or less. I can't remember the year he died. Ask Google it. Google knows.
1865.
If say, yeah, okay, 65, good. So if our only information about Lincoln came from 1965, would you have the same amount of confidence? Yeah, probably not. Probably not. Okay. And so the fact that some of those early Christian documents were written within 10 or 20 years of the actual events. Keep in mind that when the Christian movement started, they were just running around believing and sharing, and it took them a while of doing that before they settled down and said, we should probably write some of this stuff down. Right? And so the Gospels we think were written in the 50s and 60s, and some of the letters of Paul earlier than that. We believe that there's an early confession of faith that Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15 that most scholars think is very, very ancient, that came very close to that. So most of the testimony in the New Testament is early. Okay, the testimony was given by eyewitnesses. In other words, the authors or the sources that the authors had access to were actually there for the events. Matthew was one of the apostles of Jesus, and he wrote based on his own personal recollection. Mark was not an apostle of Jesus, but he was an associate of Peter. And Mark wrote down the information that he got from Peter about Jesus. A lot of people think that Mark was the first gospel to Peter. Luke was a Gentile who was converted in the ministry of Paul, but he had access to all of the early people, and he says at the beginning of Luke, he says, I've searched very carefully and I've investigated this so that you can know the certainty of what you've been taught. And so basically what he did is he went back and he interviewed all these people that he met who were original companions of Jesus or whatever to compile his gospel. Okay? Yeah, and if you read the beginning of Luke, it talks about it right there. John was one of the apostles of Jesus and wrote his gospel. His gospel, we believe, was the latest to be written. It contains a fair amount of theological reflection. But John had first-hand experience, and so that's why a lot of the material that you have in John does not appear in the other three gospels, because he's writing out of them. Okay? Here's the next one. You have embarrassing. Does embarrassing have 2 R's or 1? I think 1. Embarrassing. I should probably not put a space in there. Embarrassing testimony. Okay? All right. So like for instance, if the apostles just made it all up, they would not have made themselves to like be slow-witted or didn't catch on quickly or denied Jesus or ran away when he was arrested. Like for the leaders of the early church, there's a lot in there that's very embarrassing. If they were making it up, they would not have made women the first observers of the resurrection, okay? Because the testimony of women was not accepted in Jewish courts. If they were making it up, they would have had men. They would have had Jewish men. They would have had faithful Jewish men. The reason that they show in the Gospels that women were the first witnesses of the resurrection is because that's how it happened. Okay? Right? So embarrassing testimony, and if you look at many of the ways that the New Testament challenges some of the social norms of the day, like if they were just making it up, they would not have done that. They would not have done it. Okay? Excruciating testimony. Okay? This is a reference to the fact that right, so Jesus had 12 apostles originally, and then Judas betrayed him and died, which left 11 of the original. They actually added Matthias later. But of those, John lived his whole life out in exile in Patmos, and the other 10 were martyred for their faith. In other words, they all were killed at different times and in various ways for following Jesus. Okay? And so the word martyr, of course, means witness. You don't let yourself be killed for something that you know is false. Okay? So they went to their graves believing that it was true. And then the last thing is expected testimony. Is that in the New Testament you have fulfillments of a large number of Old Testament prophecies that indicate in different ways that Jesus was exactly the kind of Messiah that had been predicted by the prophets all along. If you're interested in kind of digging into that a little bit, I'd say the easiest pieces to wrap your head around would be Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22. Both of which contain clear, specific prophecies that were specifically fulfilled in the life of Jesus. And a lot of those prophecies are the kind of thing that Jesus couldn't have read and say, oh, I'm going to do this, right? Like the prophecy that he would be born in Bethlehem. It's like, well, sorry, Jesus couldn't control, the place that he was born. Being raised in Galilee and Nazareth, right? In Isaiah, it says the Galilee of the Gentiles and people walking in darkness have seen a great light. Like that's going to be the place. Right? Well, Jesus didn't have control of where he grew up, but sure enough, he did. So a lot of those. Like some of them you could maybe go back and manufacture, but a lot of them you could. All right. Any questions about any of this?
I just got it written down.
Okay. All right. I'll mention just a few of my sources here. I didn't bring as many books with me this time. So I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. The thing I like about Turek is he footnotes heavily and he tells you what his sources are, which is good to know. Because again, this is a popularization, but he's relying on some scholarship to make those claims. Doug Powell did this little quick source to Christian apologetics. So there's lots of pictures and everything, but he's a footnoter also, which again, as a scholar myself, I really like that. And then Kenneth Boa and Robert Bowman did a little book called 20 Compelling Evidences That God Exists. It's actually more than just an argument for the existence of God, it's an argument for Christianity. Like the second half of the book gets specific about Jesus. And then the quote, I didn't bring it with me, but the quote I put in there on the argument from Christ is from C.S. Lewis's classic book, Mere Christianity. There is a moral argument for the truth of Christianity in the first 35 pages of Mere Christianity that is fantastic. Lewis, really, really brilliant man. And so if you're interested in reading some more, those would be definitely worth checking out. All right. Last call for questions. We're 5 after. I gotta be done. All right. Here's what we're gonna do next week. Next week we're gonna do evil and suffering, and we're gonna talk about sexuality. And if I have time, I'm gonna try to have time. We're gonna do the minimal facts approach to the resurrection of Jesus. It's like, how can we? What is the evidence that Jesus actually got up from the dead? So if I have time, that's what we're gonna do. All right. Thanks everyone. Appreciate your patient attention.